Future generations will look back and see that fiat was just this little blip in history between the sound money of gold and the sound money of Bitcoin. If you have a money printer, you're gonna print money. Oh, we need a little bit of inflation because it drives consumerism. Why do we need consumerism? Their target inflation is 2%. That means that somebody is stealing that percentage. I say, why is it not negative 2%? The debt Ponzi that they've created is going to burst. I don't want to be involved in it. Oh, fiat is never gonna fail. Well, I'd call losing 99% of the value a failure. We need a way out. Bitcoin, it is a fixed money. It's money that actually works. It's fair. It helps the people the most. We've never had something that we could say is truly scarce. That alone is profound. We've needed a currency that could move as fast as electricity since the telegraph. Oh, this is the thing? The perfect money. XRP is so obvious how much of a scam it is. Proof of stake, that's just central banking with extra steps. You start to understand that Bitcoin is better money than all of these things. If Bitcoin is savings, then MSTR is investing. It's completely normal to get 5 to 10 times leverage to buy a home. That's crazy. Houses are going to trend towards their utility value. When I learned all that, I just started swapping out my money for Bitcoin. It's just a no-brainer. Get some Bitcoin in case it catches on, and in my opinion, go all in on Bitcoin.
What is your favorite thing about Bitcoin?
Well, it's a great question. My favorite thing about Bitcoin is really that it...
All right, ForrestHODL, man. Thanks for being here. Appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks, John, for having me. I appreciate it. I'm stoked to talk Bitcoin.
Yeah, man, me too. All right, ForrestHODL on Twitter, the Bitcoin Not Crypto Show on YouTube. You're crushing it. I know you just also started the Maple Bitcoin channel with a couple other fellow Canadians, Rajat and Jor. So you guys are putting out awesome content. I appreciate what you're doing. Let's launch right into it. What is your favorite thing about Bitcoin?
Well, it's a great question. It's a hard question because there's many things and they change, right? Like, I think my favorite thing about it is that it is a fixed money. It's money that actually works properly and it's fair and it's deflationary. And I think that when we actually look at a lot of the problems in the world, they kind of end up being caused, like the initial causation of them is from money being broken. You can look as simple as like the overconsumption of goods. Like there's like a rampant consumption that we have as a society, in developed worlds. And it's like, this is kind of maybe part of it is a subconscious feeling that you need to acquire stuff now because your value is being eroded over time. Your savings mechanism, your money that you have is being eroded. I know that when I've adopted Bitcoin, I started thinking about my purchases a lot more carefully. And this is a criticism of Bitcoin from some people. They say, oh, we need a little bit of inflation because it drives consumerism. And I just think, why do we need consumerism to function as a world? Like, maybe that benefits some big businesses that their entire business is based around consumerism, but I actually don't care about them. And that kind of comes back to like, my favorite thing about Bitcoin is really that it helps the people the most, because we've been disenfranchised by the money printer, by the people that control a lot of stuff. A lot of my life I've had a very different, weird life, I guess, but a lot of it had an undercurrent of wanting to change things, protesting against stuff, wanting a different world, a better world. And when I found Bitcoin and started to understand actually how it was, I was like, oh, this is the thing that if we get some serious adoption, if this becomes what I think it has the potential to become, which is the base layer monetary system, then that will actually change all these things that I really care about. So that starts to begin to explain some of my favorite things about Bitcoin, I would say.
No, that's awesome. I mean, obviously, I'm aligned with a lot of what you said, as evidenced by the fact that I have a show about Bitcoin. But I think that's the thing where people always think we're crazy, or they think it's a cult, or they think Bitcoiners are nuts, because the deeper the rabbit hole goes, we start going, wait, it fixes the housing crisis. Wait, it fixes the overconsumption crisis. Wait, it fixes, all these things, the energy crisis. Wait a sec. Like, how is this possible that this thing can have its tentacles in so many different places? And I think that people who outside of it, like just look at us and they think we're nuts because they're like, well, how can that possibly? I mean, you mentioned the deflationary piece and how most people born in the fishbowl thinking inflation is good for us and we're supposed to have that and we need that to have a growing economy. How do you conceptualize that, or how do you explain that further to people? Like, why? No, we don't need more money supply just to let the economy grow.
So the fixed supply thing is interesting, right? Because if we have money that's inflationary, in there is kind of the idea of no supply cap, right? The debt ceiling can get raised. The central banks can just print more money. And the kind of the idea there is that more money is good, right? We should all just, that creates abundance because that's more money. What it's actually kind of doing is that anybody who has money, the supply of that money is increasing. And the first thing you learn about economics is supply and demand. And when, right, again, so money is increasing, the supply is increasing. If demand stays the same, that means that the value of that good, in this case, money, has to go down, right? So that's what we've seen over time. We've seen the erosion of purchasing power. But there's, the idea that as long as it's divisible enough that any amount of a current or of a money could work as currency for the world. And Bitcoin being digital money, programmable money even, one Bitcoin can be devised down at this current state into 100 million Satoshis, subunits. And there's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin. So there is a supply cap in the amount of Bitcoin. This is also another thing that people get confused about. Oh, well, it's if you can divide it so much, then, there's people that seriously think like if you can just divide it infinitely, then it's not deflationary, or it doesn't have a max supply because you can divide it. But those small pieces of a Bitcoin are not a Bitcoin. They all add up, or 100,000 of them add up to a Bitcoin.
So we've been using pizza analogy forever, right? And every once in a while, this makes the rounds as some dum-dum on Twitter with a large following will say Bitcoin's not infinite or not finite because it's divisible, and then we'll all mock them and whatever. And we always do the pizza analogy. And lately, I've been trying to think. One that I was trying to come up with and trying to figure out whether it works was like, do they think a mile is infinitely long because you can subdivide a mile into feet and then inches and then centimeters and then nanometers? You could keep dividing it. Right. It doesn't mean it gets longer. It's just mind-boggling when people throw those things of FUD out about Bitcoin where they haven't thought about it for 2 seconds, right? Like, that's crazy.
It's not understanding what a unit of account is, right? Like those being able to break a mile up into feet, that's just another type of unit of account, but like the distance doesn't change. And so, I think that's a great analogy actually. But yeah, the pizza one is great because it's kind of this idea of like, you have one pizza, or you could say it's one Bitcoin. You divide it into infinite slices, or into these little, slivers of pizza, and you can feed the world because you can cut it into so many more pieces, which is just not really true. It's still the same pizza. But what we can see over time with something like Bitcoin being a true max supply, which we could even talk about the fact that we've never seen a max supply anything ever in existence, right? And other cryptocurrencies can say they have a max supply, but they actually don't really. We don't have the assurance that they do, at least. So Bitcoin, in my eyes, is like the only true asset with a true fixed supply. That alone is profound. Like the fact that we've never had something that we could say is truly scarce. And scarcity is one of the aspects of what makes money valuable. And so, to kind of come back, I think, to your original question there was, how would it work to use something that's deflationary or has a fixed supply like this? Well, everything else lowers in value based on the fact that the supply of this thing does not increase. Whereas what we have now with inflationary money is all of these other goods that we use this money, that we spend this money for, those prices have to increase because we continue printing more money. So it literally becomes the opposite. These prices decrease in the unit of account of something with a fixed supply, like Bitcoin. And this is actually, in my opinion, more connected to reality, because as humans, we are deflationary. We have the incentive. We naturally are inclined to create more efficient systems. Our brains pick out patterns really well. We work together very well. We're a social creature, and we create all sorts of deflationary technology. I think about, like how easy it is to build a home today compared to how, an equivalent home 100 years ago. Took a lot more human hours, a lot more time, energy, right? And those things are essentially what money is. And this all kind of relates back to the idea of an inflationary currency. Why do we have something that is so important to the way that we live, which is money, right? Every day we wake up, we go to work, we care about money. Money is so important to us all. Why do we have something that is fundamentally unnatural in the way of being inflationary when nature or human nature is deflationary? So we need something just to match that. And a lot of people say, okay, well, the US Fed has said their target inflation is 2%. And I say, why is it not negative 2%? Not even just 0%. It should be negative, right? Because the rest of the world, like I said, is deflationary. And when it's not in line with that, when it's not in line with the natural deflationary side of what technology does, then there's something wrong. And there's actually what I have figured out and learned is that means that somebody is stealing that percentage from somebody, right? And what it is basically is whoever's closest to the new money is stealing that from people that are furthest away from the new money. And when I learned all that, I just started swapping out my money for Bitcoin. It's just a no-brainer. I don't see any other way around it, but it just being a completely no-brainer to get some Bitcoin in case it catches on, and in my opinion, to go all in on Bitcoin.
When I first started listening to Jeff Booth and reading his book, and it's like, wait a second, this is the natural, like, of course, everything we make technologically is deflationary. Like, all we do is create more efficiencies. Prices should be coming down. Wait a second, it's like nuts that they're not. Like, what a weird thing. The guy watched a video of a guy the other day. Of course, my problem is they never connect it back to the fundamental issue, but he was basically like, a TV in the 70s cost $500. A TV today costs $500. A house in the 70s costs $5,000. A house now costs over $100,000. He was like in a certain median range or whatever he was analogizing, or the down payment, I can't remember. But it was like, why has a TV stayed at the same price and a house has gone up? It's like, well, actually, the TV should have gone way friggin' down too. Like, that's what we don't realize. The house has gone up because it's scarce, desirable, more and more dollars chasing it. And we've created tremendous efficiencies in making the TVs, and they should be going down further. They should be practically free by now, except that the Fed's just going to make sure that there's inflation no matter what. And you mentioned that 2% target, which, like
arbitrary.
You said, made it up.
Yeah.
Comes out of nowhere. Like you said, once you realize it, you're like, how could I not start exchanging, handing in these paper IOUs for something that's actually fixed and real? Do you know there's a subreddit called Buttcoin where they just hate on Bitcoin?
Yeah. I know Buttcoin. It's pretty, I know Buttcoin.
So, like, the other one that they always say, something you said reminded me of this. They always say, like, what do you price Bitcoin in? You're pricing it in dollars. And I'm like, how is this? How do they think that that's a gotcha? Because you can denominate anything in anything else. All denominations are in the eye of the beholder.
That's the unit of account stage, right?
Yes.
I see a state where, Bitcoin actually ends up looking stable, but it's actually just that, when you look at charts, you look at tickers, it's always the ticker symbol and then USD next to it. Mm-hmm. So what I'm going to see in the future is the whatever gold or, commodities are the same, right? So, pork belly futures, and then Bitcoin, right? And all of these other things are going to fluctuate in price against Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's going to basically look stable, but it's still, it's the monetary system, so it's going to fluctuate as well. But all of these other things are going to absorb that fluctuation of value of what Bitcoin is. That's the unit of account stage, and right now, our unit of account is US dollars. But it's not stable either. We can see charts, it's lost 99% of its value or something. And the thing is it could just continue to do that. Like people are like, oh, fiat is never going to fail. And it's like, well, I'd call losing 99% of the value a failure, but it can go down another 99%. And from there, it can go down another 99%, right? It could literally just continue going down forever, or at least like past our lifetimes, right? But typically, like on average, fiat currencies fail every 22 years or something. So that's like a complete default on the currency. US dollar's been around for longer than that, so I guess it's a success for a fiat currency so far.
Yeah, well, like the way I'm trying to come up with the right analogy, like with the pizza thing. Same thing. I've been trying to come up with the right analogy to help people understand the dollar is the thing you're measuring everything else against, but the dollar itself is not a fixed measurement of value. The dollar is changing. So, of course, it's not an accurate measure of the real value of anything else. So, again, back to my mile thing, I'm like, well, what if a mile is 5,280 feet and you're trying to measure it with a ruler, and every day the length of the ruler changes? Yeah. Like, of course, you're like, well, miles are so volatile. You're like, no, dude. Like,
miles are volatile. That's hilarious. That's very funny. Yeah, it's a measuring, and I actually think Bitcoin is the best measuring tool. We see it fluctuate like crazy. People say, oh, it has the implied volatility of 60 and all this, right? Yeah, it looks like that, but like it's the only thing that we know. Again, back to what I said earlier, it's the only thing we know with absolute digital scarcity. So that kind of is like, that gives you a lot more certainty over what this thing is. And I think overall, it's going to end up being a much better measuring stick. It's not gonna, the supply isn't just randomly going to increase, completely out of our control and also out of our purview. Like, the Fed has said, oh, we're not doing QE, but they've, changed up their reverse repo situation. They've lowered interest. Like all these things affect the amount of liquidity in the system and the amount of credit creation and the amount of debt and the amount of basically currency debasement that happens. And it's very hard to calculate all these things. They intentionally try to, smoke and mirrors you so that you can't. The CPI, which tracks consumer price inflation. It's the consumer price index, I believe, but it tracks basically the prices of things. The breakfast in there used to be eggs and bacon. It's now cold cereal. They used to put in steak. Now they put in ground beef. So how accurate is this, right? It's something that like that measurement tool is really fluctuating. Like, that ruler is, 12 inches and then 14 and then 10, it's like very hard to measure with. So, again, I think Bitcoin is a lot more stable than this when you actually look at what it is. And I think that that's one place that it will eventually shine is in the unit of account phase when it hits that.
This is probably a Jack Mahler's thing I'm stealing, but our time and energy are like the two most finite things we have on this earth. So if you're taking your time and energy and then the thing you're getting back for them is not fixed itself and can just be debased by someone else, by definition, they're devaluing the literal value of your life. Like this is where it gets like very deep and like, I feel like I'm, trying to be a preacher or something. Cause it's like, I posted something like that where I said that some guy commented like an eye roll emoji. And I'm like, you don't care? You don't care about that? What are you talking about? You don't care that they have the ability to, you spend 40 years of your life working and they can just devalue it. Not only 2% a year, which is nothing more than a promise that the value of your savings will be cut in half in 30 years. That's what 2% a year means. That's their best case scenario. Mm-hmm. That's if their CPI measurement is accurate, which like you said, it's not. But 40 years, you work your life for 40 years and then they can, we just printed a lot more money last year than we said we were going to. So now we devalued it by 9%. Sorry.
It's really crazy. And it's kind of a crazy comparison to make, but you stated in there kind of like, and what I got from that is like they're stealing your time and energy, which is your life, right? You you only have a certain amount of days in your life before you die, and if somebody's stealing that, we can look at like a situation that's very extreme, like slavery. What is that but stealing another human being's time and energy? And this might not seem like that because it isn't so encapsulating. It isn't like something done by, brute force and all this kind of stuff, right? Like depending on what your vision of slavery is. But it's like this slight degree where it's like just bad enough that you notice it, but not so much that you really stand up against it. Unless you're in a place of the world where inflation is so bad that it's like extremely obvious and you need to immediately get out of that system. But in my eyes, like fiat creates a type of slavery because it steals people's energy and time, which is their life force.
Well, like you said, the hyperinflation examples are a much more concrete example of that. If you say, well, someone's worked their entire life, they've saved their money, and it gets devalued 50% a year or 50% overnight or whatever in these countries where they've changing the prices in the store hourly because the money is devaluing so fast. I mean, that is literally someone's entire life savings going to zero. And obviously we don't have that in the US, but we act like it's impossible, couldn't happen here. There's, checks and balances in place to make sure that doesn't happen. But in theory, yes, but we shouldn't be blind to the idea that, like you said earlier, I think every fiat currency in history has gone to zero. So it's like the Roman Empire fell basically because of this reason.
And we've never had a way out of this either. So like when fiat currencies failed in the past, that person, any savings they had is just wiped out. And they're just like, okay, well, I kind of have to move on. I have, a lot of people try to escape that in some ways, like, even buying like food staples or something with whatever somebody is willing to give them for that fiat currency before it becomes absolute zero. Or, people save their wealth in cows in some places in the world. Or again, in something historical that retains its value, like precious metal. But none of these things are really that good as an escape vehicle for them. And the other thing too is it's very hard to use any of those as a currency. So you have to swap back to some type of currency when there's a new one that's formed. And because of that inconvenience of using them as a money, people are willing to jump onto another fiat currency when a government gets reestablished after a default, or, they'll just make a new currency and they'll say, hey, this one is better because we're more stable. Like, again, it's probably not backed by anything. And then, now we have Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin was born out of the 2008 financial crisis, which in all right, like if everything wasn't super corrupt, basically, a lot more banks, a lot more people, a lot more businesses should have failed at that time. A lot bigger businesses should have failed, but they were deemed systemically important, and their toxic assets were bought by the government, and they were bailed out by the taxpayers. This should have been a moment where, people would say, "Hey, this isn't any good. Let's just let the free market destroy these businesses that were over leveraged, over risk, didn't have the reserves for all of these different things." That didn't happen, and it was a moment of a large amount of money printing. Since then, we've had a few of those, but Bitcoin was built out of that. It was released a year after in 2009, and it was completely in a response to this what Satoshi and the other early developers saw as kind of a tragedy or something that was wrong. The actions that the U.S. government did were wrong in that state. So now with that, they've designed it. It's worked. It's continued to work. We've had it for 16 years now, and it continues to work. And things get built on top of it. It works even better as money, right? People can transact peer to peer. They can use second layer solutions for very quick, rapid currency-like transactions digitally. And we've gotten more digital as individuals and as society. So it makes sense that we have a digital money. I actually love this thing I just heard the other day. I don't know how much this relates to it, but it was a quote that said, we've needed a digital currency since the telegraph, not since computers. And it's because when the telegraph was invented, our ability to communicate and basically create work was faster than our ability to transact for that work to happen. We still had to physically move gold to another place. Even if we made a deal, right, we had to just trust that that deal was going to happen until that gold got to that location and that transaction happened. Or even still, a bunch of banknotes, right, that were redeemable for gold at the time. So we've needed a digital currency or a currency that could move as fast as electricity at that time since the telegraph. And it's now made possible. And it's made possible with all of these intricacies that are incredibly intellectually stimulating, like proof of work, difficulty adjustment, supply issuance, supply cap, UTXOs, wallets, cryptography, like all of these intricate things that all work together to create what I believe to be the perfect money, which is Bitcoin. So we all have a way out now, and the debt's gotten worse around the world, and we need a way out, in my opinion.
No, I mean, so many great threads I want to pull on from what you just said. But like, I watched this video the other day. This I think it's a banker, and it's on the bank's YouTube channel, and he put this out, and he's like explaining Bitcoin to like what seemingly is probably like a very normie boomer intro level 101 audience. But they have this ask the expert thing. So I'm like, you're positioning yourself as an expert, dude. You better get it right. So he wasn't terrible, but he got a lot of things wrong. And then there's this one part where he starts describing Bitcoin. He's like, well, in 2009, there was a person named Satoshi Nakamoto, and he and his friends released a paper, and it was a lot of fun. And I was like, bro, hold on. Like, you're making the cypherpunk sound like they were playing tiddlywinks in their garage. Like that's not what this was about. This is what you said, which is prior to that, we had no way out of governments inflating our money supply and having this liability of the central bank that we have no control over, and there's no escape. Essentially, they were trying to solve that problem, and it had this history of decades of people trying to develop e-cash and the reasons it wouldn't work, and it was too centralized and they couldn't solve the Byzantine generals problem. It's like this was a serious endeavor, and the problem it's solving is like the most serious problem on earth. Like you said, it's not like a joke, like fun little, oh, well, we released a paper and it's an academic exercise and it's super cute. It's like, no, dude. Like he's like saw what the governments did in 2008 and was like, we need a solution that the people can use to not get screwed by this forever. And when COVID happened, I can't remember, some government official basically said their lesson from 2008 was we didn't print enough money and we didn't do it fast enough. So in COVID, they were like, more, faster. That was their lesson. That's what they learned from that. And you're like, wow, okay, like, all right, that's the lesson you learned. The lesson we learned is buy some in Bitcoin.
No doubt. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, that massive dip, that liquidity grab that happened during COVID for assets when all of a sudden lockdowns were announced and Bitcoin dropped to, I don't know, it was like maybe $3,000 or something. Like it was really low. It was like, yeah, that should have been. And then they just started printing money like crazy. And it's like GDP is a measurement we have. Okay, this country has GDP of 4% a year or something like that. It's like, but what is their inflation rate? How much monetary debasement do they have? And how much of this GDP from these companies and all the work that's going on is actually just a result of increased money supply? And so all of these companies, that's kind of what led me to Bitcoin, really, to study it deeper. Is I came into some money and I started thinking, how do I protect this money? And I started researching investing, and I said, oh, okay, well, people recommend you put it in the S&P 500. Okay, well, what's the S&P 500 return? And it's like what 12%, average or something like that. And then once you start learning about inflation, you're like, well, inflation is, this hard thing to calculate, but maybe it's 5%. So maybe I'm only earning 7% annually. And then it's like, okay, is there anything better than that? Like, that doesn't seem like I'm going to retain my wealth very well, or get fabulously rich from investing. And then you just go deeper down the rabbit hole. You start looking at what sound money is compared to paper money, gold, and then of course everything, all roads lead to Bitcoin, right? And you start to realize, okay, well, it solves a lot of the issues of gold. The transportation is one of them that I already mentioned with the telegraph. But accountability too. We really don't know how much gold is out there. We don't know what the max supply is. If energy becomes almost free, we could fly all over the universe and mine gold if we wanted to, right? And then it's really an unlimited supply cap. I know that's a crazy idea, but if energy becomes near free, that will unlock a lot of gold deposits, but it will actually just increase the hash rate of Bitcoin. And because of the difficulty adjustment, and because there's only a certain amount of Bitcoin released out of the Coinbase, or there's only fees after that, it doesn't actually create more Bitcoin the more energy you put behind it. It's the same amount of Bitcoin. So it doesn't suffer from that problem like gold does. The divisibility, the accountability. Again, what I touched on there, but like we don't know, how much gold is in all these vaults around the world. We don't know how much is in the ground. We don't know how much individuals are holding. These are all estimates, but that's another thing that Bitcoin solved by creating a public blockchain, and you can run software and you can verify it. You can verify all the way to the Genesis block, the first one. And you can verify every transaction that happens. You can see every wallet that holds Bitcoin. You don't necessarily know who it's connected to. That part can be disconnected, depending on some variables. But that's okay. We should have privacy within our money as well. The ability to have privacy, in my opinion. That supply and that currency, that money that you can audit yourself, and literally Bitcoin audits itself every 10 minutes. That's what's so crazy. That solves that major issue of gold. I'm planning on making a video soon, really just hitting the gold bugs where it hurts and showing them how superior Bitcoin is. I know that a lot of people have talked about that, but it's true. And, like gold failed basically in some key respects. And that's why fiat currency or paper gold was created, to solve those problems, to make it more divisible, to make it more transportable. And then once they went off the gold standard, it just became fiat. And that is, in my eyes, we'll look back at this history, our future generations will look back and see that fiat was just this little blip in history between the sound money of gold, which had its problems, and the sound money of Bitcoin, which solves a lot of those problems.
Well, you touched a little on your story about kind of going through the orange pill journey of how you were like, where do I put this money? And you start learning about money. I mean, you mentioned a couple different things. One that sort of orange pilled me a little is like seeing you talked about the GDP, which is like, why is aggregate spending our measure of productivity, and government spending is a component of that. So like when it's not high enough, well, the government could just spend more money, make the number go up nominally. Nominal growth is not real growth. Like, and then I saw the M2, the like you said, the chart of M2 against the S&P 500, and it's basically the same line. And I was like, wait a second. Like, yeah. And then there's a clip making the rounds of a professor, NYU or whatever, who said the same thing. He was like, worked in TradFi for 25 years. And then one day he realized, well, if the money printer goes burr to the tune of 9% a year and the S&P 500 goes up 9.5% a year, hold on a second. Like, that's all nominal gains and it's not real. Oh, and by the way, your nominal gains have capital gains tax on them. So when you take that out, you're not ahead.
Yeah, that was probably, I think his name's Tad Smith on the Bitcoin Treasuries podcast with Tim Kotzman. Great clip and very true. And then yeah, once you factor in tax in that, the number goes up, right? Because of inflation, your wealth goes up nominally. But that just means you're going to fit into some higher tax brackets. That means whatever gains you have are going to be taxed even more. And that's kind of built into the system. That's like another insidious kind of trick, maybe, that doesn't feel so good. So, yeah, I mean, the whole system's rigged against you.
Yeah.
And it's really rigged against you when you participate in it. And I really think that Bitcoin is like another monetary system that allows you to hold your value and your wealth outside of the system. And that alone has a lot of value. And that's why a lot of adoption is happening. And that's why number go up technology.
Yeah, for real. Well, I mean, I'm not saying it's a good thing that the government's going to always forever continue to print money, but you can always know that Bitcoin is going to continue to go up because, like we said, A, they need GDP to go up. B, the debt is so large that they can't pay it back, so they have to keep printing money, which is a Ponzi scheme. And C, government tax receipts are a function of capital gains taxes. So they need asset prices to continue to go up in nominal terms so that we pay larger taxes in our capital gains, and their tax revenue continues to go up. So it cannot function without asset prices continue to going up. So that means houses, that means everything. But Bitcoin, like you said, the most, because adoption increasing the most, more and more dollars, just going to be chasing those finite amount of 21 million Bitcoin, no matter what happens.
Yeah, and like you said, it's a paying your debt, paying off their debt with like more debt and with money printing. It's a Ponzi, but it's a Ponzi with a counterfeiter as well. It's like having debt, but also owning like the money printer, which is exactly what they have. Especially the U.S. specifically, they can print a lot more than other nations. Yeah, and part of my orange pilling journey as well was just like really trying to look at the risks of Bitcoin. Like I tried to look at, you look at the debt, when you look at a company, you look at the debt ratio to assets to liabilities, you project future earnings, you look at competitors, you're assessing the risks, right? And so I was looking at Bitcoin, and you look deeper and you start to say, okay, well, what else is it compared to? Well, it's compared maybe to other sound money like gold. And then, we've already had that discussion here. And then you look at other cryptocurrencies and you start to say, okay, well, if they're proof of stake, that's just central banking with extra steps. If they're proof of work, do they have the network effect that Bitcoin has? Will they ever be able to carve out some niche within there? Probably not, because Bitcoin's already taken over. And it's kind of like, I just watched this video recently talking about Bitcoin. I think it was Andreas Antonopoulos who talked about how it's kind of like an invasive species, where if Bitcoin takes over a certain area and it's very good at, it's like he compared it to like a rabbit. If a rabbit takes over, they can multiply, they can kind of push out any other species. And then if there's a species that tries to go in there that is even more efficient, it still can't compete because of how many rabbits there are. They're just the fact that the network has gotten so big doesn't allow another network to compete with it. So that kind of, when I figured that out, I was like, okay, well, Bitcoin stands above all these other cryptocurrencies that people who are undereducated in the space, in my opinion, really do think are a threat to Bitcoin. And then the other risk to Bitcoin is monetary, like global monetary responsibility, and, shutting off the money printer and getting back to some sort of sound money standard, or being responsible with spending as far as governments and central banks and all these people that benefit from it. And I just immediately was like, okay, well, that's not a risk, because we have history to prove that if you have a money printer, you're going to print money. And so, and even more so, right? Like if your debt accumulates higher, if the problems become bigger, you're going to spend even more to try to get yourself out of those problems that the past has created for you. So it's just going to get worse and worse and worse over time until it hits, a breaking point. And we don't know when that is, right? We see bubbles. They don't gradually deflate, they pop. So we don't know when the debt Ponzi that they've created is going to burst. but I don't want to be involved in it if I don't have to be. So again, that was just a risk that I evaluated and said, okay, well, that really isn't a risk to Bitcoin at all because governments are going to spend money.
Right. No kidding. I mean, there's that Hayek quote that obviously I'm sure Bitcoiners all pass around from time to time where he said, we'll never have a good money again unless we take the thing out of the hands of government. And the only way to do that is to slyly introduce something that they can't stop. And it's just like so unbelievably prescient. They said that I don't know how many years ago, but before Bitcoin came out. And once all the things that you just said, you just pull that up into a ball and you're like, well, of course, the evolution of humanity essentially is we can't just keep doing this fiat experiment over and over and over when you have just stacking up evidence of how it doesn't work. Like how many civilizations have to crumble, how many countries have to hyperinflate for us to be like, oh, well, the solution is we'll just only do it 2% at a time. That's the answer. Like, how do you arrive at that? It's like, oh, and we'll trust the people at the top that when they say that it's only 2%, because the problem is maybe if it actually was, we wouldn't be in such. But Bitcoin technically right now is still technically inflating.
Yeah.
It's just that we know the supply issuance, we know it's scheduled, and we know the cap at the end when it ends. Those are the two things that matter most. It's not just the fact that there's more being introduced, because right now technically Bitcoin is inflationary. So it's like it matters that you're able to predict into the future how much on a regular basis, and then when does it end?
Exactly. It's transparent, which is so important. Yeah, so it is inflating, but what, at 450 new Bitcoin a day, and with the recent, institutionalization or interest from institutions, I should say, that just gets eaten up immediately by the likes of MicroStrategy or Strategy Now and BlackRock, all the new ETF buyers, and it's technically inflationary, but again, it's transparent, and that's okay as long as we know what it is and we all agree and value it based on its inflation that it currently has, and knowing that at some point that will stop.
You talked about Bitcoin as the winner because you see so many people who, like you said, undereducated in this space. Well, why won't Bitcoin just be replaced by something else? And you talked about a little bit network effects. Can you explain further, like how do you say to the people who are like, well, XRP is better because it's faster, ETH is better because it has smart contracts or whatever, when people who kind of just like, oh, Bitcoin's legacy tech or whatever they want to say, what's your kind of little further explanation or go-to of why Bitcoin will not be taken over by something else that's better?
Yeah, well, it's a complex conversation, and I think these shills and people that are interested in these other things and push out the information. XRP is such a easy one to talk about because it's so obvious how much of a scam it is. But it's the talking points, basically, they're going to pick talking points where they can win, and they're going to say that's what's important. So they're going to say transaction speed is important, XRP is faster. Well, actually, when you look at money, security is actually the most important thing, because if you cannot have a final confirmation of a transaction, then that transaction it might as well be invalid if it can be reversed at some point. We've seen the reversal of many transactions with ETH, Ethereum Classic, and the DAO hack and stuff. But XRP is even more centralized, right? They have 10 or 15 companies that run the ledger, and or institutions or whatever that run the ledger, and those could all just be Brad's buddies. Like, we have no idea, and they could just be doing whatever they want with the ledger. In fact, their first ledger entry is like 33,000 or something. So they just lost, the beginning, all those transactions. That some of those might have been legitimate, right? Like, what would happen if you had a transaction and you have no record of it? It's no longer a transaction. It no longer exists. So that thing, you have no proof of it happening. And so really it comes down to studying money, right? And you start to understand that Bitcoin is better money than all of these things because of the decentralized nature of it, is a big part of it. And because of the immutability of the ledger. And if you actually go back into history, money oftentimes started, it didn't always start as like seashells or precious metals that they were trading, a lot of money was actually a credit-based system, and it was, carved into tablets. And it was, this person owes me 3 cows. This person owes me 3 bushels of grain. And it was a ledger, right? And a ledger is like what our entire monetary system is built on, but these ledgers are centralized. Your bank has a ledger based on all of the accounts that it holds. And what Bitcoin has done with all of these other things around it, they've created money, but as well, they have a ledger which shows all of the transactions and all of the history and all of the proof within there. So that's incredibly important to money. And if any of these ledgers are compromised, which they all are, all altcoins have some sort of centralization problem, basically, because they have founders, and you can't replicate what Bitcoin did. The reason Bitcoin worked is because no one cared about it, and it was allowed to grow in a very small, natural way, and it was able to distribute itself throughout, and people were able to start running nodes very cheaply. They were able to mine. They were able to get onto the network in a very organic way. If you try to create something like Bitcoin today, people are going to immediately try to take it over because of how small it is. And that is possible to do with if it's proof of work. They could take over the mining of it, and they could do a 51% attack really easily and change the transactions in their favor. They could double spend. With Bitcoin, it's basically impossible. It might as well be impossible at this point. So you have to explain so much to counter, because their understanding of it has been skewed by what they think is important, and most likely they haven't researched the history of money and what makes good money. So it's a lot to talk, and usually I don't try to convince too many people. But my channel's name is Bitcoin, not crypto. And I do think that out of a lot of different types of people out there, the people that you can convince to at least start allocating something to Bitcoin and begin to understand Bitcoin are probably people who have gotten into crypto more broadly. And that was a big reason I started my channel. Was I went to a party and I wore, the Satoshi shirt with the Nirvana symbol kind of thing or whatever. And
Jack Dorsey's favorite shirt.
Yeah, exactly. Jack Dorsey's maybe only shirt, and 3 people at that party. It was all finance people through a friend of mine, and 3 people at that party said, "Hey, cool shirt." And I said, "Hey, are you into Bitcoin?" And the one guy said, "Oh, I'm into the Solana ecosystem." And the other one was like, "I worked for a blockchain company in Texas," and then I started talking to him about Bitcoin. He's like, "I've actually just learned more about Bitcoin than I ever learned at a company that I worked in marketing for." And I was like, "You worked at a crypto company, and I just told you more in a 2-minute conversation about your entire industry than you knew." Comparing Bitcoin to ETH and stuff, because he had some idea of what ETH was. And so that kind of led me to the idea of like, there's a lot of people that are interested in crypto that have no idea what Bitcoin is. And I think this is some sort of way of getting these people over. But it can be incredibly frustrating as well, because they think they're right, and they think they honestly look at Bitcoiners as like the boomers in the space. Like, you guys like this old dinosaur technology that's so slow. And it's like, yeah, but why is it slow? You ask yourself some questions. Why is it slow? Is there a reason it's slow? Because it could easily be faster, but would it work as well if it was? Or would it break?
100%. It's the trade-offs, right? Like everything, you have the blockchain trilemma of essentially, I think, decentralization, security, and scalability.
Yeah.
You can optimize for 2 but not all 3. So you're sacrificing something if you're changing what Bitcoin optimized for. I stumbled across like a really old set of Adam Back tweets recently, where he basically, I think it was like in 2013, he was like, "I spent multiple days on end trying to improve on Bitcoin and like come up with every possible way I could make it better. And contrary to what I presumed at the time, you cannot make it better without making it worse in some other way." Right? Like it can't be done. And it was like, yeah, you mentioned like the immaculate conception of like how it was created. And then the spontaneous monetization piece of like, it literally had no fiat denominated exchange rate from the beginning. which cannot happen again. Of course, the cat's out of the bag. Everybody who's creating a coin or a token at this point knows they're trying to pump their own bags. So like the whole point is, how much can I get it to be worth before I can dump it on somebody else? There's no like, oh, it'll be created without other people rushing in and knowing that they can make money off it. This just could never possibly happen again.
There's no such thing as a fair launch. Any cryptocurrency that claims to have it doesn't exist. There's always is going to be some early adopters dumping on retail, knowing that that's what they're going to do. When people got into Bitcoin, they didn't know they were going to sell this for something else. They thought they were creating a money system that they could transact. They could send their friends some Bitcoin if they mined some, and it was just this organic thing. It had no value for years, and until basically Laszlo, I think his name was, bought 2 Papa John's pizzas, which was like $21 American, for 10,000 Bitcoin. And I think this year, that 10,000 Bitcoin is going to be higher than the market cap of Papa John's. That's a prediction I have right here, because I think the market cap is, I think it's going to be higher this year. If Bitcoin gets to like 140,000, it's going to be higher than Papa John's.
That'd be great. What a symbolic moment, and you see people saying like, "Oh, I feel so bad for that guy," but at the same time, hey, I think he's still around. Like, I'm sure he has more Bitcoin. He's not like, that was my only Bitcoin, But also, it's like that was like a sacrifice for the future of the network, right? It's like somebody had to kind of like. I like when people don't like when people say like, "Oh, Satoshi Nakamoto created this and to enrich himself," and like, how do you know he's not going to dump on everybody and he's just waiting? It's like, no, it literally, like you said, had no value for multiple years. There was no like foresight that I'm going to sell it when it reaches $1 trillion. Like, that's not, if you just take yourself back to 2009, then there have been multiple failed e-caches before, like we talked about. So there's no guarantee that this would ever catch on or not have a giant failure bug, somewhere in it that nobody had caught at that point. So it's just kind of fascinating that monetization piece, where obviously, like we said, can't possibly happen again. And the people who kind of think that something else is better or are going to take it over, like you said, I haven't studied money. This was another one of my biggest, orange pills, was going down the rabbit hole. What is money? Why do people value gold? You talked about the gold bugs. I don't want to kick them in the teeth too hard, because I think they were carrying the sound money torch before we came along. So totally. Like, yeah, I'm a young buck to the sound money game, so I'm not gonna like crap on them too hard. They just didn't have the right tool yet. It's not their fault. But if you understand why people value gold from the beginning and the properties that it held that made it good money, and then you understand that Bitcoin was engineered to have the same properties. This is another reason why Satoshi's like, how did he know all that? Like, he knew so much. He knew the cryptography piece, the software development piece, and the economics piece, and the monetary history piece of like, these are the properties it has to have to make it a digital equivalent of gold. And then it has to have its own monetary settlement network, like you talked about, where it can be settled instantly, because transactions, I think it was in Lynn Alden's book of Broken Money, she talked about, that's the thing you mentioned, of transactions are always faster than settlement. But now, it's the first time in history where that's not true, basically.
Yeah, I'm going to be the first one to say it, but Satoshi, I think, was a pretty smart guy. I think he thought about all these things, or I don't know, maybe it just worked out. Like, even the timing of the election year and the global M2 cycles, going with the halving of Bitcoin, which is the supply issuance getting cut in half through miners. I mean, it just all seems to work. And like, I don't know, I'd actually kind of like to hear your perspective about this, but I kind of look at the Satoshi coins, right? Where there's an estimate of maybe 1 million Bitcoin that Satoshi mined in all these different wallets. I kind of look at that as like the ultimate honeypot. Like, this network is so secure that there's just 1 million Bitcoin right here. If you can take it, go ahead. But because it's designed so well and so safe, you're not going to ever be able to. That's kind of how I see that, those coins being locked up in there.
It's like a bug bounty, right? Like, it's the ultimate bug bounty. So there's no network, no cryptography, or essentially, has been pressure tested more than Bitcoin, probably, right? Because you have this honeypot that the greatest incentive, if you can crack it, you're going to get $1 trillion. So of course there's people trying to crack it. Of course, no one's been able to. Now, I mentioned Bitcoin before, and like I sometimes I see a lot of these things through the lens of I want to understand, like you said, what are the risks? I want to understand what's all the FUD. I want to personally be able to know the answer and be able to rebut each piece of FUD that people are going to throw at it. So that if I'm at that party you talked about, and somebody goes, "Well, why isn't quantum computing going to just destroy Bitcoin?" I want to have the answer ready so that they don't walk away going, "Oh, Bitcoin guys don't know what they're talking about." I'll be like, "No, I had the answer." So you see the quantum computing FUD recently, and I've been digging into like what's the realities of it. I'm making video about this on the channel too, right? My biggest thing is everything's a risk reward trade off. You need to weigh out the risk of you not choosing not to invest in Bitcoin because you're afraid of quantum computing. How likely is quantum computing going to come along and break Bitcoin versus you just losing money and missing out on the gains you would have made when you waited 20 years because you're like, oh, quantum computing is going to break it. It's like, it's not going to happen anytime soon. But the piece I think is interesting is supposedly, I'm not technical enough to really know this to it down to a T. Supposedly it's some of the, like a wallet like that. Like I think there's a video of Andreas saying that he thinks that one day Satoshi's wallet will get broken into because we can upgrade the network and the security of like how we hold private keys. And if you have an active wallet, you can upgrade to a new quantum resistant algorithm. Right. But the dead ones, we probably can't. So someday, in theory, those lost coins could get hacked and released back into the supply, which I think is kind of wild. I mean, I don't think it's gonna ruin anything, but it'd be pretty wild if somebody had like $1 trillion exploit that they created or whatever. I don't know how to predict that into the future or know whether that's an issue or not.
Yeah, it is an interesting idea and entirely possible. We don't know the future, right? We don't know how I mean, theoretically, right, quantum computing could crack the encryption on if those old wallets weren't updated or couldn't be updated, right? I know there is a lot of there is the ability to make Bitcoin quantum resistant, and that would just take getting it approved, basically, with all the nodes, the developers, and the miners. Yeah, I don't see quantum computing being a risk, although it is just it's an interesting thing to know about and to like see into the future how it develops. I think,
yeah. I mean, I think people see like a Google Willow headline and they're like, I got when that came out on my like TikToks or whatever. Bunch of people, their first comment is like, quantum computing is going to destroy that. Have fun with your little coins, and whatever. And I'm like, that's really your reason to not buy the thing that has a 50 to 60% CAGR year over year? Like, that's your reason? Is like, oh, quantum computing is going to break it tomorrow. It's like, you haven't spent 2 seconds thinking about that, and your Chase Bank password would probably like password 123. Like, what are we talking about here? Like, either it's going to break into your Chase Bank quicker, probably.
Yeah, for sure. But the thing with the Bitcoin is that it is decentralized, and so like, if somebody used quantum computing to break into a bank, then there would maybe be some criminal charges against them if they got caught. But if they like took from Satoshi, maybe there's some like gray area there. But I also saw some information, and again, I'm also not that technical, but supposedly it would be easier to do the plot of the movie Office Space than to hack Bitcoin, which I don't know if you've seen Office Space, but it's like taking like a fraction of a penny from transactions that are mismatched and just putting that into an account. So, I mean, people would probably do that first because they can get away with that too without being noticed.
I'm probably going to butcher this, but it was Eric Yakes who I saw. He did he had a video where he talked about he had read Jimmy Song's book and he talked about quantum computing and will that destroy Bitcoin? And he dug into this and he was basically like did all the technical deep dive, which I'm going to butcher some of it, but it's basically like to brute force private keys. Computers just try they just try over and over and over. There's no other way to reverse engineer a private key. Well, right now it's 2 to the 256th, and there's a prime number in there that they're trying to find. That's what the computer's trying to find. Well, 2 to the 256th is 10 to the 77th, and the estimated number of atoms in the universe is 10 to the 80th. So, like, it basically said the number was like a computer trying a trillion tries, a trillion computers trying a trillion computations every trillionth of a second for a trillion years is how many it would take to get like quantum.
Insane.
So our quantum computers are going to get that fast in the next couple decades? Like I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't see it as a risk, and I think that it'll be pretty easy to just make it one more number so it's more that much more difficult, right?
Right. Like we'll be able to find larger prime numbers with the
Exactly.
same technology that would be used to. So
Yeah.
yeah. Cool, man. Well, this has been a super fun discussion. I'm sorry if at the end I get too excited and I'm like throwing too many of my thoughts at you and I'm like not letting you talk.
No, it's great, man. No, it's great.
Well, let's hit on MSTR a little
Sure.
bit. I mean, I've watched a bunch of your MSTR content and you explain a lot of it and like you've really clearly done a deep dive to really understand it. I don't know whether you consider yourself a Bitcoin maxi or if you don't like that term or whatever, but if someone's a Bitcoin maxi and they're thinking about should I buy MSTR? Should I just buy Bitcoin? How do you think about that?
Yeah. So, okay. So, well, MSTR is a growth company. So, a really easy way to think about it is if Bitcoin is savings, then MSTR is investing. And you're expecting that your shares of MSTR, if you're buying the common A shares, that the amount of Bitcoin kind of underlying that is going to increase over time, which they've historically been able to do. So, they track that with a KPI they have, which is Bitcoin yield. So your question kind of, why don't I just buy Bitcoin right now? Well, if you had enough money to buy one Bitcoin today, basically, let's say Bitcoin's 100,000, right? If you bought one Bitcoin or if you bought $100,000 worth of MicroStrategy shares and you look at the MNAV, which is the multiple to net asset value of MicroStrategy, it's basically at around 2 right now in fully diluted shares. So your shares of MicroStrategy would be the underlying Bitcoin on them would be half a Bitcoin, right? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then you calculate in the Bitcoin yield. So last year they had a 75% Bitcoin yield. This year they're aiming for a 15%. They're going to knock that out of the water. Absolutely. Just based on what they've already gotten right now, they already have a 4.1% yield, and it's only February 13th. If you extrapolate that out to the rest of the year, that's 36.5% Bitcoin yield. So it would take you roughly 2.3 years. I know all these these numbers because I literally just made a video about this. It would take you 2.3 years at that yield, that Bitcoin yield of 36.5 to get one Bitcoin underneath the same amount of shares with the dilution.
To have your MicroStrategy shares and their exposure to Bitcoin be worth the same as what the one Bitcoin is worth, basically.
Yes.
If I'm saying it right.
If you could, yeah, exactly. So back to the original, if you just bought one Bitcoin today,
Right.
or if you bought the MicroStrategy shares, it's going to take 2.3 years to be allotted to the same amount of Bitcoin exposure with MicroStrategy. And then if you hold MicroStrategy longer and they continue to get more Bitcoin and they continue having a Bitcoin yield, then you're actually increasing the amount of Bitcoin exposure you have with that same amount of initial money that could have just bought you one Bitcoin to begin with. And there's other things, right? MicroStrategy is a company. Bitcoin is, they're two completely different things. Mm-hmm. So MicroStrategy being an equity means that they're going to be put into passive funds. They're already in the QQQ. So not only are you could measure this just with the Bitcoin yield and the Bitcoin underlying, but you can also measure either Bitcoin and MicroStrategy in their fiat denominated terms. And so you might actually expect MicroStrategy to outperform Bitcoin in certain periods of time in fiat denominated terms because there might be more demand for MicroStrategy. Depending on, there's these passive buyers in funds. There's captive buyers in other markets around the world that aren't even allowed to buy Bitcoin ETFs or couldn't buy Bitcoin directly or have some sort of money. Like even myself, I have some money. So I do own MicroStrategy, and I own MicroStrategy in registered accounts where the only other option I have is to buy Bitcoin ETFs. Mm-hmm. So either I buy a Bitcoin ETF where, yes, I get twice as much Bitcoin today as I do for the underlying MicroStrategy shares, but every year, because of the expense ratio, I'm actually getting less Bitcoin allotted to those ETF shares. And every year, if I believe in what MicroStrategy is doing, if I don't see a default risk, which I really don't, they have very little leverage right now. Their leverage ratio is like 6%. They aim for 25 to 30% leverage, which leverage creates risk, which could create some sort of default. But at one point, they were 136% leveraged in a bear market. So, and they didn't default them then. So I really don't see that happening in the future anyway. But so if you hold ETFs, you're actually getting less Bitcoin per share every year because of that expense ratio. It's very minimal. A lot of these ETFs have very low expense ratios, but it's kind of with MicroStrategy, you're expecting yourself to get more Bitcoin per share. And and again, it's a completely different separate thing. Like I actually value the Bitcoin I have in cold storage a lot more than my MicroStrategy shares because it's actual Bitcoin. MicroStrategy, yes, you have the exposure to the underlying Bitcoin, but you could never trade in directly your MicroStrategy shares for real Bitcoin. It's just you can only trade it for fiat. So it's a different mechanism. To me, and then why I explore it so much is because of all of the interesting things that MicroStrategy is doing. It opens up another can of worms, or another set of doors to go down. So it's a rabbit hole on its own. Bitcoin's a rabbit hole, and then MicroStrategy is a rabbit hole. So
Totally,
to me,
yeah, that's
it's
true. I mean,
intellectually interesting.
yeah, totally. You can see that in the last year or even maybe 6 months, how much it's exploded in the conversation and in Twitter and YouTube and everything, and how much people love talking about it and how interesting it is because it's like the most compelling thing happening in TradFi.
Yeah.
Like to them, it's got to be like normal boring stuff, and then this is like one of the craziest thing anyone's ever seen. Well, so tell me if you think that my characterization of sort of bear case, summarizing some of what you said, bull case, bear case for MicroStrategy, I would say bull case, like you said, is their Bitcoin yields continue to go up. So the dollars that you've allocated to the shares you bought are going to be exposed to more and more, or underlyingly own more and more Bitcoin over time. And therefore you own exposure to more and more Bitcoin over time. And therefore, if you hold longer than like that, 2-year period that you talked about, you end up in a place where, well, I own more Bitcoin, not literally, but more price exposure to Bitcoin. And then bear case is, well, you have these other risks associated with it, which is like, there's so much more counterparty risk. What if they change their strategy? What if they sell? What if they whatever? Or what if they take on too much leverage and they mismanage it as a company? So you kind of have these downsides that basically are like, do I buy and believe in that they will continue to execute the strategy successfully? And that would be your kind of like, okay, that's my downside risk, but my upside risk is I take that money that I'm allotting now, and that could go up more than Bitcoin goes up if I hold it long enough and they continue to increase that BTC yield.
Yeah, and also it's the other bear case scenario is if the cycles of Bitcoin continue and Bitcoin has a down year, then MicroStrategy, it does have leverage and it does have exposure, and there's a lot of people that will or there's a lot of reasons why it would actually go down quicker than Bitcoin, potentially. I mean, there's maybe reasons why it wouldn't, but you kind of have to consider those. But it is just a play, it's a play on Bitcoin. It's like a type of wrapped Bitcoin is the way I look at it. It's a corporate wrapped Bitcoin with the MicroStrategy team at the at the handle of it. So yeah, like you're exposed to Bitcoin. Is that what you want to be, right? So there's the risk of that, right? So if Bitcoin goes down, MicroStrategy is going to go down, right? It's going to move in a similar direction, not exactly correlated. It's some people treat it like a 2 times leverage or a 3 times leverage or something like that of Bitcoin, but it's not, and it deviates from Bitcoin quite often because they're issuing new equity to buy Bitcoin. So they're pushing up the price of Bitcoin, but they're pushing down the price of their own equity at the same time. So it shouldn't be treated exactly like Bitcoin, but it definitely, like, if there's a bear market in Bitcoin, MicroStrategy is going to get hit hard as well, I think.
Yeah, and like you said, the biggest one is like retirement accounts or whatever, where you can't buy real Bitcoin. I think that's like basically, I think that's where I own it too, where it's like, and even before the ETFs came out, MicroStrategy was the only place to get exposure, and now it's sort of a trade-off between ETFs or MicroStrategy. You can't own real Bitcoin in there anyway. So
yeah. And there's a lot of other companies now kind of adopting this as well. Similar, Metaplanet was the best performing stock of all time, or of the last year, and their Japanese stock, and their situation is even more like, it's even harder to expose yourself to Bitcoin in Japan. So Metaplanet becomes a way of people being able to do that. And then the debt market is so interesting there. They just issued standard debt yesterday, I think $23 million worth of standard debt at a 0% rate, unsecured. So it's literally like the only way that I can see that somebody would buy that debt and it would be worth more in the future is if Metaplanet's credit rating goes up, which it could happen because it's going to be put into the MSCI Japan index and all these other things. But because they're literally getting no percentage, and if Metaplanet goes out of business, they get no equity or they get no cash reimbursement because it's unsecured. So I don't know. It's crazy. Like that can only happen in Japan where the interest rates are so low to begin with.
Right. I don't understand everything about that. I haven't looked into it or whatever, but like to me that's some fiat ass shit right there where it's like we can print money for free. So let's just hand over $23 million of it because it's not worth jack. I mean, like no offense to Meta, but they're like taking advantage of the fiat system, right? It's like, well, let's take on some 23 million yen that aren't worth jack diddly that someone will give us for almost nothing and use it to buy some Bitcoin. Like it's kind of a weird symptom of the existing legacy system crashing with the new system. Yeah. Wow.
Well, it's what we talked about earlier with Bitcoin, where it affects savers, like it destroys savings. It has the exact same effect on debt as well. So you want to be a debt holder, which is another perverse incentive, I think.
Totally.
I don't think that we should create people who want to be debt holders, or that people that become debt holders become wealthier because of that. But right now we have this opportunity, and where we could do that as individuals, and MicroStrategy and Metaplanet and Semler, all these companies, they're all taking advantage of that. They're shorting this fiat dollar and they're longing a sound asset with fixed issuance and a supply cap. It can be. You can think about all these things in very deep layers, but you could literally just think of it as like a currency arbitrage play.
Straight up shorting fiat. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's another, like when you go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and you kind of start understanding money. I mean, maybe I'm a dum-dum for not understanding this sooner, but like real estate has always been one of the biggest wealth creators. And part of the reason for that is that real estate goes up in value, but part of the reason for that is asset values get pumped by inflation. Inflation is a two-sided coin: asset inflation and price inflation. So price inflation for the poor's, asset inflation for the rich, and the dichotomy gets larger and the gap gets larger and larger. So the play has always been short the dollar, take on as much debt as you can, as cheaply as you can. The richer you are, and the closer you are to the money printer, and the more you have as collateral, the cheaper they'll give you the new money. So it's like, it's just crazy. And if you're poor and you have no assets, then they'll give you really, really expensive debt. And that'll just then you're way more likely to just go bust anyways. So we have this pushing both sides farther and farther away from each other.
Yeah. And we have this, it's completely normal to get leverage 10 times or maybe 5 to 10 times leverage to buy a home. Like that's crazy. That is so risky. You sure hope that those asset prices go up. And there could be two simple changes. There could be reduced regulation for building, and there could be some sort of death tax on homes. And all of a sudden, that house is no longer a store of value at all. And it's destroyed your savings account, basically, if you've treated real estate as a savings account. So, I mean, that to me is very risky. Real estate is way riskier than people think it is.
You talked about perverse incentives where now that mortgage-backed securities are literally held by the Fed, we saw in 2008, the whole system is so built on top of the idea that homes are a good investment and they must go up in value.
Yeah.
They can't not go up in value anymore because it takes everything down with it. So it's kind of this crazy perverse incentive and it's a whole generation of boomers and all their net worth is wrapped up in their homes. Like everything relies on the idea that homes must continue to go up in value. When again, really, the money printer is what's really inflating that more than, and the regulations can't change, even though we have a housing crisis, because the regulations would make the hit to the fact that that's the key store of value that's underpinning like the entire system. It's oh man, snake's eating its own tail.
It is. And I guess the third thing there is people could recognize a better store of value than real estate, which is Bitcoin, right? So I think that's inevitably going to happen. I think houses are going to trend towards their utility value as people realize what Bitcoin is. And I think that's great. I think we have a huge problem. I live in Canada and housing here is unbelievable. It's completely unaffordable. Every single one of my friends would love for people to recognize that rotting wood and drywall is not a good way to store your value, because we need to live and we don't need it to be so unaffordable. So that's a great knock-on effect. That might actually be one of my favorite things about Bitcoin, is that it could make housing more affordable for people.
Yeah. That's another one of the rabbit hole things where, like, when I started to realize that, I was like, wait, holy crap, like the knock-on effects of this Bitcoin thing are nuts. And your boy Rajat talks about that a ton. Like, he kind of has gotten a little bit of some heat and like a little bit of a reputation for kind of being the guy who, just slams real estate and pumps Bitcoin, because he's talked about it a lot. He does a great job explaining it, and the real estate people are pretty pissed about it.
Yeah. Rajat's pretty ruthless with the real estate bashing for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a good transition. Tell us about Maple Bitcoin, with what you're doing with those guys, a new channel with those two, with Rajat and Jor.
Yeah.
And then tell us a little bit about your channel, Bitcoin Not Crypto. And then you also have a documentary that you're crowdfunding and making about Bitcoin in 2025, right? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, Maple Bitcoin, a new channel with Rajat Soni and Jor from 88 Sats Radio. So we all teamed up, all three Canadians, Bitcoin people. We decided, we all actually were on each other's channels, just like this, like I am with you. And then Rajat was like, hey, I really vibed with both of you guys. You guys want to do some stuff together? And then Maple Bitcoin came out of that. So
yeah, that's cool.
We release a lot of stuff on there. And my own channel as well. I talk about Bitcoin, MicroStrategy. I try to release a lot of videos, a lot of hopefully helpful content for new people in the space. Get them onto Bitcoin, away from crypto. My channel's name is Bitcoin Not Crypto. And I'm a filmmaker by trade. I run a media business called Different Media, and I've made all sorts of different documentaries throughout my past. But with my interest in Bitcoin now, I've decided to go down that rabbit hole. I have a geyser fund to crowdfund this film called The Land of Volcanoes and Bitcoin. It's about the history of El Salvador to some degree, and their adoption of Bitcoin, and how it could affect them, how it affects them in the present, how it could affect them in the future. And Geyser's a really cool website where people can donate to a cause using Bitcoin. So, if you've never used Bitcoin before, it's a great opportunity to do that for the first time and support a documentary that will eventually get made.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can't wait to see the doc, how it comes together, and see when it comes out. All right, the other thing I like to ask is, name one piece of content or one creator you like in the space that's not you, or that you go to for as a resource.
Oh, okay. I got this. Yeah. So I've had him on my channel before, but one of my favorite Bitcoin channels that is just emerging, there's a lot of OGs out there that everyone should follow for sure. This guy's a little under the radar, Gen Z BTC.
I talked to him a few days ago. Yeah,
did you?
An episode coming out with him, probably before your episode comes out.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Satoshi Guapamoto, he goes by.
Yeah.
He makes great videos. I watch every single one of them. They're short, they're concise, they're hilarious, and they're great. I love his content. So yeah, I recommend checking him out.
Super cool, like unique voice in the space. He's got great personality, and he's like obviously targeting like a demo. I think that's needed to target, in the space or whatever. And he's got like the blackboard behind him, and he's just kind of like going for it. Yeah, I dig his stuff too. That's a good recommendation.
Yeah, he represents the people that still live in their mom's basement, wage slaves in the mom's basement, figuring out Bitcoin. I mean, that kid is so smart, man. I'm just impressed every time I watch his videos.
Cool. Yeah, that's a great recommendation. All right, man, this was awesome. I know I kept you longer than I originally asked for. I appreciate you being super gracious with your time.
Of course, John.
Your wealth of knowledge, the stuff you're putting out is awesome. And obviously that's why I reached out to you, because I've been watching your channel, and I think you have great info. You obviously very clearly know what you're talking about, done the deep dive. So I appreciate what you're doing, and thanks for coming on the show, man.
Thanks for having me, John. I appreciate it. It was fun.